Hi, I'm Harpreet Singh. I'm the director of the Division of Oncology 2 within FDA's Office of Oncologic Diseases, and I'm also a geriatrician by training, so very interested in the topic of SAEs in older adults with serious illness, and thank you so much for having me. I'm joined today by Doctors Shaylee Arora and Abby Nair, both of whom are Associate Directors for Safety within the Oncology Office. I wanted to provide an FDA, but also really an OCE and oncology perspective, because I think we've taken the lead on a few initiatives that I think are worth mentioning on general safety reporting, and I hope that we can use the discussion period as a to engender important conversation. I have no disclosures. So I wanted to talk a little bit about regulatory definitions in terms of the 21 CFR, or Code of Federal Regulations, SAEs versus serious unexpected adverse reactions. You may have heard of these as SUSARs. And I hope to get into a little bit of collection of data versus reporting of data, as well as the role of the IRB, what needs to be reported to the IRB versus the FDA, because they are quite different, and some of our efforts around over-reporting from industry sponsors, and finally end with an example of regulatory flexibility in palliative settings. So there are several guidances out on safety reporting for INDs to industry and to investigators. And I want to highlight that in 2010, the FDA issued a final rule amending its regulations that governed IND safety reporting, such that the definitions for reporting were really clarified. And the idea for this was to reduce the number of uninformative reports distributed by sponsors. This was identified as an issue, and I'll get into it a little bit later in the talk about whether or not this was effective. Certainly, the evaluation of safety is a process that evolves, and the data that's available depends on the stage of development of the product, usually. We include safety information on approved products in the label, and we expect that the investigator's brochure has up-to-date safety information. Safety monitoring takes many forms. In terms of adverse events, there's of course serious adverse events, which we will define and talk about, unexpected adverse events versus common lab abnormalities and adverse reactions. So let's get into a little bit about what's required to submit to the IRB. This comes from FDA guidance. So an unanticipated AE, something that is serious, that is unexpected, uncommon, and strongly associated with drug exposure. This would be something like angioedema or Stevens-Johnson's. Could be a single occurrence or a small number of occurrences that is not as commonly associated with drug exposure, but is uncommon in the study population. Tendon rupture with one of a commonly used antibiotic is something that would have needed to be reported. You also want to do aggregate analyses to determine that this is an unanticipated problem. So a determination should be made that these AEs actually represent a signal and we're not just isolated occurrences. Also, even if something is addressed in the investigator's brochure or in the consent, if the AE seems to occur at a severity that's inconsistent with prior observations, or the rate at which it's occurring seems to be significantly higher, clinically significant, then this is something that should be reported to the IRB. I like this figure because it talks about, a suspected adverse reaction is an adverse event with a reasonable possibility of drug-related causality. This is something that's at the investigator's discretion, but certainly I think you have your adverse events, your adverse reactions, and those that are suspected reasonably suspected to be drug-related are considered suspected adverse reactions. A serious adverse event. It is a regulatory definition. It is something that is found there in 21 CFR listed. And it is anything that certainly a suspected adverse reaction is considered serious if, in the view of either or, the investigator or sponsor, it results in either death, a life-threatening adverse event, an inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of an existing hospitalization, or a persistent or significant incapacity or substantial disruption of the ability to conduct normal life functions. So these are serious adverse events. These should be collected, the following should be considered. Is it common in the population under study? I think that's something to take into account as we talk about older adults with critical illness or serious illness. Was it treatment emergent? How does it respond to de-challenge? Did it recur on re-challenge? Was there an obvious alternative cause? Also worth discussion here. And worth noting as you're collecting this information, is SAE a study endpoint? Okay, so what needs to be reported from the investigator to the sponsor? This is regulatory. So all serious adverse events with causality assessment, as well as adverse events and/or lab abnormalities identified in the protocol as critical to safety evaluations. Now, finally, we get to what actually does the FDA need to know about? What this is expedited safety reporting to the FDA by sponsors. So certainly we review all SAEs in the, in drug applications, we typically read narratives on a selective basis if we're trying to investigate a signal. But those are provided within the actual drug application. What needs to be reported to the FDA in an expedited fashion? This is what you classically hear described as a SUSAR, but I will not call it that. These are adverse events that meet all three criteria, so they have to be serious, unexpected, and a suspected adverse reaction, which I've defined. If it's fatal or life-threatening, this should be reported to the FDA within 7 days. Everything else within 15 days. I'm going to highlight this again. So serious unexpected adverse reactions, if they don't meet all three criteria, you do not need to submit it to the FDA as part of the IND safety report. Okay, was the final rule effective in reducing uninformative reporting? This paper was published in 2016 in Clinical Cancer Research and by FDA colleagues, including Meredith Chuck. And basically, they looked at initial safety reports per IND over an 8-year period and found that post-2010, when the final rule was published, the number of safety reports actually increased. It did not go down as expected and as intended. And the oncology staff, the authors, did an audit of 160 randomly selected safety reports and found that only 14% were actually informative. So this is actually, it not only kind of clutters our inboxes and requires effort on behalf of the oncology staff, but really importantly, it could really compromise the detection of valid safety signals. And I think that is part of the concern when we talk to investigators as well about what may be perceived as a need to over-report, but I would suggest that it's not so much over-reporting as it is maybe perhaps what may be perceived as over collecting. So again, the difference between collecting data versus reporting is one worth mentioning. The OCE did not stop here with this publication. They published several other similar perspectives, but they also took action. So we made a list of key culprits, so to speak, or companies who were really contributing to this over-reporting, set up individual phone calls with them to talk about their policies for reporting, the methodology they were using, and also sent letters to several companies who were guilty of this. And some of them were quite responsive and were able to reduce their safety reporting to the tune of 50 to 60%. This is still an ongoing effort, but I think it did certainly help to have one-on-one conversations, clarifying examples of what should and should not be reported in an expedited fashion to the FDA. I want to end on an example of regulatory flexibility, which again, the oncology group demonstrated in terms of efficacy endpoints. Traditionally, certainly you see oncology drugs being approved on survival endpoints or progression-free survival, response rate. But in 2019, our office approved fedratinib for myelofibrosis, which can cause splenomegaly. And the primary efficacy endpoint of this trial, the Jakarta trial, was a reduction in spleen volume. This actually was not the first approval of its kind. There was another approval very similar in 2011, I believe, with ruxolitinib. So there is room for discussion, particularly when regulatory flexibility exists. I think when we talk about safety reporting, there are certainly some regulatory definitions that the FDA must abide by, barring any change, which certainly can occur and has occurred, and FDA guidance. I do think it's worth discussing in a broader group ideas around IRB versus FDA requirements, and the idea of collecting of data versus reporting, who data is reported to, and the frequency in which that is done. And certainly here to clarify any points, and I will also welcome Shaylee and Abby to the discussion and grateful that they're here. So thank you so much for having me.